can play a role in improving school safety.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what you mean by technology, whether you mean social media or...
I mean social media, and I mean physical security on campus.
Sure. So some of it is just the physical security of being able to buzz people in and out and making sure that there is secure access and security cameras and using best practices for physical safety, some of which involves the best practices for technology. But again, also we've referenced social media. I'm not a big tech expert, but certainly whatever it takes that when these signs...
The gentleman's time has expired.
Okay. It's the same, finding the signs of danger wherever they come from, whether it's...
The gentlelady from California, Ms. Spires, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your leadership. I must say that this has been a very tough hearing to listen to. First of all, let me thank all the witnesses who are here, and the first panel in particular. I'm haunted by what Dr. Guerrero said, that we went into the emergency room and one of the dead children was decapitated. Think about that, decapitated. Commissioner, when you went into the Tops grocery store, I think we spend too much time sanitizing what assault weapons does to the body. Can you give us some descriptions of what you saw on the ground when you got to Tops?
I won't just get into that description, but I've been at numerous...
No, I want you to. I want us to hear it.
Yeah, I want to expand on that. I've been to numerous shootings throughout my career that were the result of high-powered rifles, assault rifles, and the cavernous holes that they leave in bodies. Decapitation is a pretty good explanation for it. Some people couldn't be buried with an open casket. Yeah, the damage was absolutely devastating. And not just in that one, but as I said, in other homicide scenes that I've been to, the devastation is just, it's incredible.
I'm a victim of gun violence. I know what it does to a body. And I cannot believe that my colleagues don't recognize that prohibiting the sale of an assault weapon until the age of 21 isn't going to save lives. It's the impulsive actions by 18-year-old, probably men, that have caused 30 people's lives just in the last month. And we are not supposed to be hardening schools. They're not supposed to be prisons. Ms. Pringle, let me ask you, in your conversations with the teachers in the 199 incidents of gun violence on school grounds just last year, and the more than 311,000 students since Columbine that have been victims of gun violence experience, what does that inform you? What do the teachers tell you?
I met with survivors from teachers from Sandy Hook and from Parkland, and students from Parkland, and when I was in Houston, in Texas. And what they said to me reflected what teachers all over this country are saying, and that is that the impact to the school community is forever.
Is forever.
It doesn't end, it's forever. And the idea of turning our schools into prisons, into places where they are not conducive to teaching and learning, that is not the solution to this problem. We all know what the solution to this problem is. It's comprehensive gun reform in this country. We know what it is. We are not supposed to be holding our students and our teachers responsible. We all heard Mr. Reyes crying from his bed in the hospital, saying, I didn't protect my students, I didn't protect my students. He should not be burdened with that. We are asking for Congress to do its job right now.
Mr. Jackson, you too are, thank you, Ms. Pringle. Mr. Jackson, you too are a victim of gun violence. Does that trauma ever leave you?
Not one day. Anytime you hear a loud sound, anytime you see an argument or a fight or even a movement of a crowd, I'm triggered over and over again. And I don't even need that. Every day we turn on the news and we see how prevalent violence is in our communities. You know, we say over 100,000 people have been shot or injured by gun violence, but I really think that's a low estimate. Because in my community alone, I know at least 8 people who have been directly impacted. And every morning I wake up, I have to apply ointment to my wound. I have to watch news that's a reminder of this crisis. And then I also have to listen to politicians in chambers like this make excuses about why they can't take action. All of that is triggering.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. I would like to submit for the record this article that references that the young man in Uvalde who massacred 19 children and 2 teachers had $5,000 worth of guns and ammunitions, and he was working at an In-N-Out burger restaurant. And the question, Madam Chair, that we need to ask is, where did he get the money for that? I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The first thing I would like to take a moment to respond to my Republican colleagues' comment that Democrats are using children as political props. These are the same tired arguments used by the gun lobby to prevent meaningful change after Sandy Hook, after Parkland. When victims and survivors speak up and demand change, the gun industry and its supporters in Congress question their motives. It's frankly shameful. Despite suffering unimaginable pain, our witnesses wanted to share their story. Even the young lady, they have dared to hope that their trauma and heartbreak could be turned into something good. They are pleading with us to do our jobs. All I'm asking my colleagues to do is open your hearts and listen, and I hope we still have enough humanity in this body to do this. We've been talking a lot about mass shootings, and I want to thank all the witnesses. I have long talked about the everyday gun violence that exists in our communities. The city of Chicago faces this every weekend, really every day. Over Memorial Weekend, 42 people were shot and 33 people were shot this past weekend. Tackling this issue will take community-based approaches. Mr. Jackson, thank you for sharing your story and the work we've done together. Your organization used community-based approaches to fight everyday gun violence through community intervention programs. Can you talk about the structural factors that drive gun violence in a community?
Yes, thank you. You know, we are big proponents for community-based violence intervention strategies because we know they can reduce the risk factors and address the root causes of violence. Over the course of the pandemic, we saw a 39% increase in homicides in the Black community. And that's not because there were less policing. That's not because sentencing wasn't harsh. That was because the other root causes of violence were intensified. When we look at the lack of access to safe spaces, economic inequality, housing instability, the reinforcement of poverty, all of those fuel violence. And then on top of that, we poured in this flood of guns into our communities. We talked about New York earlier. 84% of the guns in New York come from outside of the state. And that's what our communities are going through every single day. We're being flooded with firearms into the communities that are most vulnerable. And these community-based violence intervention strategies focus on victim services for those who have been impacted, supporting their families, providing therapeutic care for those traumatized, providing intervention tactics that work with folks in the hospitals to prevent them from retaliating. We know that 40% of the people who have been shot within 5 years will be shot again or killed without any form of intervention, and hospital-based violence intervention does this, as well as cognitive behavioral therapeutic programs that work with those who are most at risk, who maybe have had a violent history, and help them shift their lifestyle through therapeutic and behavioral changes. In certain communities, we've seen violence reduced by 60%, and I have a whole list of examples, which I can submit to the record, but we know these programs work. What we also know is that the federal government has not been investing in these efforts, and has not been funding these efforts that we know bring peace to our community, and that's why we've been working together to push such legislation.
And hopefully we can change that and get Stephen Horsford's and Senator Booker's legislation passed. Commissioner, you helped your community heal after the horrible mass shooting last month, or you're helping them to heal, but you also see the destruction recurring, gun violence in Buffalo. Can you talk about how your police department works with organizations to implement community violence intervention strategies?
I'm a strong believer in the violence interrupters strategy. We work very closely with them. They get out in the community. They can say and do things that we can't because they're credible messengers. We use them a lot in place of where police officers might go to handle a situation. They are also very helpful in getting guns turned in at times. But the problem we have is, as my colleague over here, Mr. Jackson, said, the flood of guns that are coming into our communities, the ghost guns that are coming into our communities. And one of the scariest things I just heard the other day at a gun meeting in my department is that about a half a dozen ghost guns recently were firing fully automatic, not because they had a switch on them, because they were being modified and not modified properly, I guess, if that's a term to use for a ghost gun. But it's the flood of guns that are coming in. Where are they coming from? And we don't want to take guns away from law-abiding citizens. We want to stop the flow of guns coming in.
Well, I have a trafficking/short purchasing bill I'm going to run and talk about in a little bit, because representing Chicago, we have the same problem. And really quickly to Ms. Swearer, how do you explain the number of gun owners who support what we're trying to do, or the number of Americans that support, Democrat or Republican, doesn't matter, independents? But I was at a press conference yesterday, and a swarm, they had shirts on, of gun owners support gun safety. That's what we're talking about.
It's because it's not until you actually explain to them what existing laws are and how these laws fail to actually accomplish those goals. When you actually do that, those numbers drop repeatedly. And actually, I believe I saw it might have been the New York Times had an article precisely on this today. It's just because people don't understand what's being talked about when you reference an assault weapon or a universal background check. And so when that's explained to them, that number actually drops off considerably.
Well,
The gentlewoman's time has expired.
The head of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force is a gun owner. Val Demings is a gun owner. Many people on the task force, and they certainly know the legislation, and they're still pushing it. I yield back.
This gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And again, I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. This has been a very robust discussion, very difficult issue, brings out a lot of emotion. I appreciate everything that you all are discussing and fighting for. I have the opportunity to go first in questions, and I like to go towards the end because I like to listen to the debate, try to learn, listen to what other people say, and pick up some points that people make. And one of the points that Ms. Ocasio-Cortez made was that some of the guns, when we referenced the amount of gun violence in New York City, that a lot of those guns were coming from outside New York City. And I would say that's probably right. We have in Kentucky a fentanyl problem. I think just about every congressional district has a fentanyl problem. Our law enforcement tells us this fentanyl is coming across the border. And, you know, it's frustrating for us because we've had 100,000 deaths with fentanyl, and we believe that could be reduced by securing the border. But as I was thinking about that, I wonder if we ban certain types of weapons, Ms. Swearer, I just wondering, I wonder if the Mexican drug cartel, who is profiting from all the illegals crossing into the United States, they're profiting from all the fentanyl and much of the crystal meth that's in the United States. I wonder if it's possible that they would get into the gun business.
Well, I think that might be the least of the worries at that point. I mean, you would still have 400 million plus privately owned firearms in this country. There would need to be some sort of coherent enforcement plan. Americans routinely do not turn in these weapons. I mean, you look at, I think it was New Jersey when they banned magazines capable of either 10 or 15 rounds. Nobody turned those in. Out of a million of them, nobody turned those in. You know, the people who do turn them in, let's say we're even twice as successful as Australia. You still have 200 million guns in this country, most of them now in the hands of the lesser law-abiding segment of society who didn't bother to turn them in, who didn't turn in their assault weapons. So, I mean, you would just have, then we'd be holding hearings, too, about, you know, who is this being enforced against? If I may be blunt, these laws are less likely to be enforced against white suburbia. We're now going to be having hearings about how they're being enforced against poor people of color, and that helps no one. So, I mean, I'm not going to get into speculations about drug cartels, but I will say we will have several other problems that would be primary.
What do you think, Ms. Swear, that we should do instead of passing gun control laws to make our community safer?
I think, again, as I've outlined, one of the first things you can do is focus on the mental health and the well-being of communities. I mean, things that help communities flourish, whether it's focusing on mental health, 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides. As Mr. Jackson noted, look, there are a lot of issues that are interrelated, is very seriously interrelated with violence and violent crime. Focusing on stemming those issues, whether it's access to safe spaces, whether it's mental health, whether it is educational and job opportunities, the things that make families and communities flourish are the things that reduce violent crime. And again, it does more than reduce violent crime, because now we're talking about human flourishing on top of that.
Right. My friend Rokana also mentioned about violent criminals having guns, and our position is violent criminals should be in jail. I think that's the position of everyone on this side of the aisle. How can we empower our law enforcement professionals and our criminal justice system to bring violent criminals to justice and keep them off our streets?
Well, I think, I'm hesitant to actually blame law enforcement for a lot of those issues.
I'm not blaming law
right,
enforcement.
Right, no, I mean, at the end of the day, what happens to them afterwards that's out of the hands of law enforcement. That's local prosecution.
Exactly.
Prosecution. That's, dealing with laws about the parameters of what those prosecutors can and can't do.
Right.
So I think it's more complex than that, and it's going to come down to what state or locality we're talking about where that problem might exist, but that is a major focus. Yes,
very, very good. I agree. There's a trend in a lot of the cities where there's the most violence with guns. These cities have strict gun control laws already in the books that the criminals aren't abiding by, but they also have many prosecutors, including the one in San Francisco who was recalled last night, who have been very lax on criminals. I think the criminal justice system was created to try to help people that had been unfairly incarcerated for minor things like marijuana possession. I think there's bipartisan support for people who are in prison for little things like marijuana possession to be let go. I support that. But I think it's gone too far, and we have criminals now that are on the streets, and that's not good. In the name of COVID, a lot of prisoners in this town, Washington, D.C., were let out, and we've seen, a spike in crime. So I think that there are many points we need to consider moving forward. Obviously, and Madam Chair, I'm wrapping up, obviously, we need to invest in school security. We need to invest in resource officers. We need to have better trained school resource officers, and we need to share data on mental health issues and any potential threats with kids from social media and things like that. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence, you are now recognized.
Thank you so much. History teaches us a lot of things. We've heard our educators and our community organizers, our law enforcement talk about the stagnant action of nothing. So we'll have someone like Ms. Swear come in and say that it's not the guns. The guns are not the problem. Keep them coming. Everybody has that right. And we move forward. Then there's another shooting, but it's not the guns. You can't kill someone and shoot multiple rounds without a weapon. We own cars in America. In order to own a car in America, you first have to buy it and get a registration for it. In order for you to operate a car, you have to take a test and you have to follow laws. If you fail to do that, that car is taken from you. It's a car, it's not a gun. And we are still talking about background checks. We're still talking about, yes, we need to talk about mental illness. But what happens after we do all our prayers and best wishes, which I can say my colleagues on the other side are beautiful at prayers and best wishes, but never bring forth a bill that will address this crisis in America. It is unacceptable. We cry and we think about these babies. We heard the descriptions of these bodies where a person who was clearly unfit to own a gun walked in and legally purchased purchased a gun at 18 and used that gun within hours to not only kill his family, shoot it, or injure his family, but others. It comes a point in time when it's this deflect, don't do it, because if they pass one law, it's a slippery slope. I've heard it. Don't let them take away your guns. That's our right. When in America, when we have more guns than people, does the sickness of operating and owning a gun kicks in that we in America have a problem? I know for a fact, if you drive a car, you bought it, you have to put on a seatbelt. We don't care if it's uncomfortable. We don't care if you don't like it. You have to put that seatbelt on. And if you don't put that seatbelt on, we will take away, if you repeatedly do it, we'll take away your license to drive that car. First of all, we studied the deaths, and we found out how many people die in car crashes. And you know what? We said, we want to stop the deaths in car crashes. And look at all the innovation, airbags, seatbelts. We stepped up as America. And we keep talking about our faith in God and how we love people and equality. How can we say we love God when we take a gun and shoot and kill people, and if someone does it, you sit back and drop your head and say prayers and best wishes? It is time for us as America and this body to stand up and confront the fact that it's sick. It's sick to think that if I have a gun, nothing is going to happen to me and I become a gigantic figure. I had a member tell me that his 5-year-old wanted a pink gun for her birthday, 5-year-old. And he said, when you get old enough for your fingers to operate the gun, I'll buy you a gun. And he did. And he thought that was a good thing. And I'm sitting there saying, you know, I would stand up in court and say you needed to go to jail. A 5-year-old with a gun. And the only purpose of a gun is to kill something. So you're giving a 5-year-old who is not mentally capable of making decisions a gun. That is sick. It's no way you can rationalize that. And you have homes throughout America, they have their gun in the back of the car, they're wearing open carry. It's like the Wild Wild West. We evolved as a country. We have all these technology and advancements, but we are literally going back to the Wild Wild West, where we stand up and we have a shoot down in the middle of the street, people die, and we just walk away and blow the smoke off the gun. It is unacceptable. And I know I'm supposed to be asking questions, but if I can just impact one person, and like my colleague said, there's a large number of Americans who say, can you just do something other than prayers and best wishes? If someone shot and killed your child, you would not be sitting here wanting to hear about my constitutional right to own a gun. Well, I'll give my prayers and best wishes for you. Because when you lose a child over gun violence, it's unacceptable. I yield back. My time is up.
The gentlelady yields back, and the gentlelady from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses here today, especially our survivors, those who shared their pain, their grief, and their trauma. I really do look forward to a day where our families and our children like little Maya, will no longer have to relive their trauma simply to compel action. Because only in America do we normalize mass shootings and the trauma left behind. Now, when a partner loses a spouse, we ascribe the word widow or widower. When a child loses their parent, we use the word orphan. There is no word to describe a parent who has suffered the devastating sorrow of losing a child. The unimaginable pain, grief, and trauma of burying your own baby. It just goes against the natural order of things. And with gun violence now the leading cause of death for children in society, now we're searching for a word for what do we call a surviving parent who has been robbed of their child due to a massacre. Only in America. So whether it is our babies learning in Uvalde, our elders grocery shopping in Buffalo, or neighbors in my district, the Massachusetts 7th, whose experience don't always make national headlines, but do deserve just as much attention. It is long past time to treat gun violence as the public health crisis that it is. We must do something about these damn guns. And yet, predictably, some are resorting to deflection and distractions, touting failed policies that do more harm than good, like arming teachers and militarizing police in our schools. Ms. Pringle, very eloquently earlier today, you said we need resources, not revolvers, in our schools. But yet we've spent $1 billion over the last 2 decades to grow our school police. Ms. Pringle, in your experience, does adding more police to schools end mass shootings, yes or no?
No.
I completely agree with you. And so do the majority of experts that have studied the impacts of police in schools. Chairwoman, I ask for unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record. 2015 study titled Preventing School Violence, Assessing Armed Guardians, School Policy and Context. 2019 report titled Cops and No Counselors. And a series of letters from the Federal School Discipline and Climate Group and more than 500 community-based organizations on the need to end the mass policing of our students and instead invest in trauma-informed services that make our schools and children safe.
Without objection.
Since Columbine, our country has approached the problem of school shootings by funding school police. $1 billion, thousands of school police officers, when 90% of our students can't access a school nurse, a social worker, or a guidance counselor. And more than 2 decades later, we find ourselves in the same spot as before, only in America. So instead of contributing to safety, the data shows that police in schools can have the opposite effect and actually result in making many students feel less secure. Ms. Pringle, what have you heard from educators and students about police in schools, especially from students who are Black, brown, LGBTQ, or disabled?
Our teachers, and in fact, all of our educators, are focused on making sure that they create a safe, welcoming environment for every single student. We know that our Black and brown and indigenous students are disproportionately impacted by the inequities in every single social system in this country.
Ms. Pringle, I'm sorry, I'm going to reclaim my time because I'm losing it here.
Go
I
ahead.
apologize. Just yes or no, outside of more police, some have recommended arming teachers, hardening our schools, and even constructing schools so that they only have one door. Is this a good idea?
It's turning our schools into prisons. That's never a good idea.
Thank you. This is not an issue of the architecture of our schools. It's about the foundation of our country and whether we care about our people, our children, more than guns. Every single life robbed by gun violence mattered. The 87-year-old at Bible study, the 27-year-old walking down the street, the 7-year-old learning to read, all had lives to live and dreams to achieve. Only in America do we consider arming teachers while failing to pay them a livable wage. Only in America do survivors have to go and start GoFundMe pages to afford mental health and trauma supports. Only in America do we expect survivors who have barely buried their loved ones to make the case for policymakers to save lives. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Brown, is now recognized via Zoom.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, for holding this hearing. I would also like to thank the witnesses for coming, and in particular, the witnesses on the first panel whose stories were simply gut-wrenching. In 2020, guns were the leading cause of death in children. Out of the 45,000 firearm-related deaths in 2020, more than 4,300 of these were children. Many more have been injured or traumatized by gun violence. Sitting here, it is hard not to feel angry that we allow so many children to be killed by guns. Now, let me be abundantly clear. My job is not to take away guns. I myself am a licensed gun owner. My job is to keep our communities safe. Our national obsession with guns is killing thousands of kids each year. Every one of those kids deserve to grow up and live a full life. We cannot sit idly by and do nothing as guns are used to kill our children and fellow Americans. So my first question is for Mr. Romali. how does a red flag law work before you begin?
A red flag law is designed that if there is some sort of a threat that is alleged, a threat to harm yourself or others, that is brought forward to law enforcement or another profession can bring that to a court. That is the due process of a judicial process where a judge will examine the evidence that was brought forward, will look to see what the circumstances are, and a judge will make a determination whether or not a weapon or weapons are to be seized, and that's for a determinate amount of time to be reviewed after a set amount of time, where then that individual who had their weapons taken can come back in again and make a claim to get their weapons back.
Thank you so much. Mr. Saplina, why are we seeing an increase in child deaths due to guns?
Well, the short answer is that we're not doing anything. We are seeing an increase in child deaths because we don't have the laws in place that we've been discussing this morning and this afternoon. We have not enacted child access prevention laws at the federal level that could protect children both from unintentional access, or rather unauthorized access, and child suicide. The reasons go on, and children are dying in homicide in this country. They're dying by suicide. They're dying by unintentional deaths, and we have not addressed that. In the states that have, we see better outcomes, and I want to emphasize that because we gloss over it so much. In the states that are enacting these laws, even though their efficacy is lessened by the influx of firearms from other states, we are seeing lower mortality rates among children and the general population.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson, for you, we have heard your testimony today about kids who have been traumatized by the horrors carried out in Uvalde and communities that look like yours and mine. Can you share with us the impacts of gun violence on child survivors as well as their friends and family members?
Yeah, I mean, what we have to realize is that they have a lifetime of trauma that they have to live with. And we know that one of the biggest indicators of whether someone will become a future victim or even an offender of violence is how have they been exposed to that trauma. And what's most terrifying for me is in both of these communities and communities all over the country, we're forgetting about victims and their trauma. We're not providing the services and support for them or their families. And there are people in Buffalo right now that have been abandoned by our government and just asked to deal with that trauma. So a huge thing that we can do now is fight for resources for community-led violence intervention and prevention strategies that includes therapeutic and trauma care for those who have been directly impacted.
Thank you so much. I think we've all heard far too many stories of gun violence. Again, I personally have been impacted by losing the lives of three young men who are part of my youth ministry that did not live to see the age of 21. This has to stop. Enough is enough. We have the tools to make a difference for families across this country. And if we can just come together and find the political will, the compassion, and the courage, and the capacity to just do it. With that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Bush, is now recognized.
St. Louis, and I thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for convening this hearing. In St. Louis, we know the devastation and the trauma of daily gun violence in our community. It's the drumbeat of violence where 6 people were killed and 14 shot within one weekend, and in one part of our community where the population is only a little over 300,000, and it's not considered an anomaly. It's the daily occurrence of trauma and heartbreak in a community reeling from a nation who's unwilling to act but can. So many people in our community have been directly harmed by gun violence, and everybody in our community has been traumatized in some way. Since the massacre of 19 students and 2 teachers at Robb Elementary in Uvalde, Texas, we have heard a lot of stories, a lot of theories about how best to protect students and how best to protect teachers. At best, these suggestions are absurd distractions, and at worst, they will further harm the very communities in need of our help the most. Communities like mine, communities like Buffalo and Uvalde, Black communities, Latino communities, AAPI communities, our schools, our churches, the list goes on. And we need to address the incidence of gun violence in this country, not with carceral interventionist solutions, but with a public health approach that's rooted in prevention. Mr. Jackson, briefly, what specific strategies has your organization employed to address the gun violence crisis in communities of color? Just briefly.
Really briefly, victim services and support for families, hospital-based violence intervention and prevention strategies, cognitive behavioral therapy programs like Ready Chicago, Advanced Peace, that work with those who are most at risk, creating safe passage for youth as they're coming home. And that's actually a short list of some of the evidence-based models that we know can save lives. And we're fighting for that. You know, cities all over the country are investing their resources. We know that community leaders all over the country, thousands of these organizations are fighting to save lives, but yet we're stuck with scraps when it comes to federal resources.
Evidence-based models that save lives. We need to pass out the pamphlet on what you're doing. I am a survivor of gun violence. I've sat with parents who lost their children to gun violence. I've heard from students who sat next to me and talked to me about how they lost friends and they lost classmates and they don't cry, they don't even feel anything anymore, all due to gun violence. Our children want action, but the strategies that I get to hear too often from my fellow colleagues and some on this committee would call for the hardening of schools and for placing armed staff and police officers in academic environments. And it tears me down because I think about as a child when we had fire drills and tornado drills and they taught us, you know, crouch down and cover your head. And I remember we would have these routine drills and I really believed that a tornado was going to come because they made us do this. I believed that a fire drill was coming. It can happen because our school is making us do this. And now they have these active shooter drills. What are we doing? I think about my nephew. I think about my son's safety at school. It's always on my mind as this unrelenting concern about not only their physical safety, but also the emotional toll that they endure through this run, hide, fight reality every single day. So, President Pringle, how has the daily reality of militarized schools and active shooter drills affected our students in these times of extreme gun violence?
We have seen evidence of increased trauma-related illnesses, physical illnesses, as well as our students reporting to us that they are afraid to come to school, that they don't want to go to a grocery store because the violence is in their communities too. We have heard from our teachers that they are leaving our profession because they don't believe that they can protect our students. But they're not stopping. We see our students rising up, don't we? They're demanding that this country protect them and pass gun laws that are common sense, where most Americans agree we should be passing. That's what our students are demanding, that's what our teachers are demanding, and that's what we'll continue to fight for.
Thank you. You know, 81% of those convicted on gun possession charges in my community in the Eastern District of Missouri are Black. And it tears me up when we talk about saving lives. How do we talk about saving lives, but we arm people to be able to take lives, and we arm them easily, and we arm them from the standpoint of it's my right. What about life? Mr. Jackson, in our efforts to save lives and prevent further harm, why is it important for lawmakers to consider the impact of gun control laws and how they affect Black and brown communities?
The gentlelady's time has expired. You may answer the question briefly, Mr. Jackson.
Because this is life or death for us. You know, this is now the #1 cause of death for Black men and the #2 cause of death for Black women and Latino men. And while this may be a political topic for Congress, this is life or death for our communities. You know, I've been nearly shot 5 times, despite going to church, like the member said before, despite saying the Pledge of Allegiance every day in school. Gun violence surrounds us every single day, and we're dropping like flies. And we don't need more carceral strategies. What we need are real investments in our communities, real investments in prevention strategies that we know work, and we need someone to stand up against the flood of firearms that are pouring into our communities. Guns don't grow on trees. We are not creating these guns. They are being flooded into our communities, and the gun industry is profiting off of our death every single day.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, is now recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. And I also want to thank all of our witnesses who have been here with us for much of the day. I think it's clear, there's no doubt that we have a gun violence crisis in our country. As a matter of fact, there have been more mass shootings this year than there have been days in the year, because there's one almost every day, and every time you pick up the paper or watch television. In addition, there's a steady drumbeat of gun violence daily, with an average of 124 people losing their lives to gun violence every day. In 2020, more than 45,000 people were killed by gun violence, the highest number in our history. The lives lost by homicide, suicide, and other gun-related injuries occur hourly, and the crushing impact of these losses expands exponentially to their loved ones and their communities. Given that gun violence is a public health problem, I am preparing to reintroduce my bill to create a dedicated funding stream for gun violence prevention. You know, an ounce of prevention, I was told, is worth much more than a pound of cure. No comparable developed nation has nearly the number of gun deaths as we do. To reduce gun violence, we need stable revenue to research it and combat it. When we talk of all the aspects of gun violence, I live in inner city America with one of the largest populations of low-income people that you find in a city in America. That is the city of Chicago. We call it the Windy City. And of course, it's a city where local elected officials have been making every effort that they could to reduce gun violence. You cannot purchase legally a handgun in the city of Chicago. Yet, handguns are flowing into our city like water flows into a river. And that's because we know that no matter how hard we try, we can't do the job that we need to do unless there is federal action. Federal. You can walk across the street into another area and purchase all the weapons that you want and manage to sneak them back into Chicago. When we talk about the trauma of gun violence, mine does not come from reading the papers or watching it. My grandson, when he was 15 years old, was killed in a little scrap with a group of kids, and they didn't even really dislike each other. They had a little group who would swap clothes. Let me wear your gym shoes tomorrow, and you wear my jacket. Let me wear your hairpiece. But they got into a little scrap, and one of the young people had a gun. And of course, another one hollered, "Shoot!" And he shot. It was the most chilling telephone call I've ever gotten from a police commander who called and said, I think I got some bad news. The trauma of that experience has wrecked his family. As a matter of fact, shortly after that, my son, his father, just kind of gave up, passed away. My granddaughter has been traumatized, and their whole family is disrupted. And so if we're going to be real in terms of what we need federal gun legislation that limits the number of guns that exist in our country. There's no reason we can't do that. We can, we should, and we must. And I thank you, Madam Chairman, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from California, Mr. DeSalle, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for this hearing. Thank you to the panelists, and in particular, thank you to the first panelist. For all of us who have lost family members to gun violence, how this can continue to happen in this country is extraordinary. It's just so depressing. And we hear the same arguments every time this happens, unfortunately. So now we have some history. Coming from a state that, according to Giffords, remember Gabby Giffords, many of us, her friend, a state, California, for years, we've worked at this on evidence-based research on policy that can save lives and stop these things from happening. So let's just look at the numbers. If you're in California, we can't stop these things from happening, and it's not that we have some kind of unique wisdom to this, but we have relied on investments in evidence-based research. And what that shows is kids are almost 60% statistically less likely to be victims of gun violence in California. Adults, all people in California are 35% less likely, statistically, not less likely, 35% less likely to be victims of gun violence, 25% less likely to be involved in a mass murder. We can do this. The problem in California is that accepting the fact that these things are going to happen, but what we're trying to do is prevent them as best we can, rather than just accepting that it's a fait accompli that somehow this is going to happen, for whatever the reasons are. And of course, we have our own suspicions about what motivates people to let this continue to happen. But one of our problems is 25% of the guns that are used in crime in California come from outside of California. So we need national standards. We will continue to do what we can do in jurisdictions that support evidence-based research, that treats this as a public health epidemic that it is. So, Mr. Spallina, to this point, in the work that you do, in my area, in the Bay Area, we have a long history, and we're doing this again. And what we call it is not here. We're just examining the evidence-based research that you and others, Giffords, CDC does so well at national comparisons and at the state level. But we're trying to bring it to the local level. And if we have things that we're preempted about, we'll go to our elected officials at the federal level, the state level, and to court if we have to. And by the way, all these laws have been in place, and they're more stringent than the ones we are considering, and they're constitutional. The courts have decided they're constitutional. So in that context, Mr. Spallini, tell us a little bit about your experience in evidence-based research and the causality and the outcomes. There are thousands of lives that have been saved by these policies. What does your work inform you to that point?
Well, Congressman, precisely that when you look at all 50 states based on their strength of gun laws and look at their rate of gun deaths, there's a direct correlation between strength of gun laws and lower rates of gun deaths. It's just statistically correlated, and it is a fact. And California, which does have some of the best gun laws in the country also has some of the lowest rates of gun violence. Not enough, there's always more to do, but I actually really appreciate the way you have framed it, because we are talking about, in a nation that does have hundreds of millions of firearms in it, we are going to continue to have incidents of firearm violence in a nation that has that many guns. But we can also do sensible things, as California has been a leader on, to reduce firearms deaths. And it just bears out in the data. You can look at it. You cited some of it, and there is more that we can be doing. I believe the programs that Mr. Jackson has been referencing throughout the afternoon are a place where, you know, California is also led, but more can be done. And I believe that the next level of our intervention here really has to be with the industry, because in California, what has happened, the industry's innovated around your laws. They've created ghost guns, which are turning up in crime scenes at record rates in California, more than any other place in the country, and they're designing around other laws. So it's time to take a look at the industry. I think California may be ready to do that, and doing so will save lives.
That's why we have to stay on it, but evidence-based research can save lives. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for this valuable hearing. If you look at the statistics, gun violence turns out to be a woman's issue. And what do these statistics show? Nearly 1 million women who are alive today have been shot or shot at by an intimate partner. And an average of 70 women are shot and killed each month by an intimate partner. Mr. Jackson, in your experience, is domestic violence a major factor in gun violence?
Yes, it is a huge factor, and it's also a huge reason why we're fighting for people-centered strategies to research the root causes of such violence and incidents. Right now, there's the Protect Black Women and Girls Act that we're strong proponents of to address the 100,000 black women and girls that go missing or are murdered every single year.
Mr. Jackson, I know that you have advocated for both community violence intervention and supply-side efforts to reduce the number of guns in circulation. How would reducing the supply of guns reduce domestic violence deaths in particular?
There have been multiple studies done, which I can supply to the record, that have shown the presence of a gun greatly increases the risk of violence against someone in the home. And when we think about gun violence and how it's terrorizing our community, and it being the #2 cause of death for black women, we need to do all we can to address this violence beyond simple policing strategies.
Thank you. Commissioner Gramaglia, in your experience, do firearms in the home heighten the risk of injury or death in a domestic dispute?
Well, I will say that we don't typically, on an annual basis, have very many domestic homicides in our community, but when you have an illegal gun in the home, it certainly does increase the risk of harm to everybody in the house.
Mr. Soplana, what effort did the coronavirus pandemic have on gun-related domestic violence?
Well, to step back for a second, the presence of a gun in the home increases the risk of homicide by 2 times, the risk of suicide by 3 times, and the risk that a domestic violence incident will become fatal by 5 times, just to lay that out for you. During the COVID-19 and the response and the lockdowns, we have real reason to be concerned that domestic violence increased even while being underreported. I don't have statistics in front of me on how domestic gun violence increased during that time period, but we know that it is a tragic form of gun violence that we often really do not hear about. In fact, many mass shootings, both ones you've heard about and ones you haven't heard about, start with an act of domestic violence, either earlier in time or directly in relation to the incident, as we've recently seen.
Mr. Soprano, currently federal law prohibits spouses with a history of domestic abuse from possessing a gun. But the so-called boyfriend loophole allows abusive dating partners, like abusive boyfriends and girlfriends, to have access. Could you explain how this boyfriend loophole works and what we could do about it?
Well, what we have to do about it is close it. There's really no reason why in 2022 we shouldn't give protection to intimate, where there's incidents of domestic violence, that we shouldn't also remove firearms where a couple is not in a married relationship. So there are efforts, as you know, in the House to close that loophole, and doing so would be very effective at reducing domestic violence deaths.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I ask unanimous consent that Representative Sheila Jackson Lee be allowed to participate without objection, so ordered. The gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is now recognized.
Madam Chair, I thank you and the chairman and all members for their generosity in yielding to me at this time. I wanted to be very sure to be in this committee meeting today. I've just come off the floor of the House. To all of you as witnesses, we are now debating the Protect Our Kids Act. I want to acknowledge Zanetta, Everhart, Dr. Guerrero, Maya, Felix, and Kimberly Rubio, and the previous witness, Ms. Hughes. To the witnesses that are here, I want to acknowledge you, and as well to acknowledge Mayor Adams for his presence here. My time is short, and so I'll be asking very pointed questions. To Mr. Sublina, I hope I pronounced it correctly. You said 2021 was the deadliest year. We are now close to that in 2022, yes or no?
We are on pace, correct.
The bill that I've introduced, the Kimberly Vaughn Safe Storage Act, among others that are in the Protect Our Kids Act, which I'll comment on, specifically deals with the requirement of point of sale for storage devices. In the instance of Kimberly Vaughn, the son stole guns from an unlocked, unsafe area, which I think goes to suicides and other uses of homicide. Is a safe storage issue an important issue as it relates to bringing down gun violence?
It is such an important issue, Congresswoman. It's important for safety in the home. It's important to keep young kids away from firearms. It's important to reduce youth suicide. It's important to reduce school shootings because guns often start in the home and are accessed when they're not safely secured. There's just no overstating the importance of child access protection laws and other secure storage laws, as well as all programs that really encourage responsible gun storage.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson, let me express my concern, but also your heroic recovery should be touted and recognized. You had a very important statistics. The #1 killer of African-American men is by premature death is by guns, second for Latinos, and second for Black women. You also have already mentioned the cycle of violence. How much of a disparity and impact in our minority communities is this gun usage and gun victimization and gun deaths? I have two other persons I want to raise a question with, so bear with me as you make a very brief answer to that. And I thank you and salute your recovery.
No, thank you, and I'll be very brief, but we've seen the largest increase of homicides since the start of the pandemic in the Black community, a 39% increase, as well as it already being 80% of homicides coming from Black or brown communities. And we're in a world now where a Black man is at a greater risk of being shot and killed than a police officer. And that shouldn't be a reality for anyone.
So protecting our kids, dealing with the prohibitive magazines, raising the age limit, getting rid of ghost guns, because I've seen some of the folk on the street with the ghost guns, stopping trafficking, which when you have a city, you know, they want to tout a city like Chicago, gun violence, but all the states around them have no laws. Would all that be part of helping to bring down the carnage?
That would be a huge help. And we need that comprehensive strategy to be applied everywhere. You know, we saw with every other health crisis that we didn't just say, oh, let's work on this one community. How do we make our entire country safer? And that's what we expect to see here.
Thank you. Commissioner, I believe in the Constitution, and in the Constitution is the Bill of Rights, and the Second Amendment is there. I, as a member of the Judiciary Committee, have no reason, no intent to take away the Second Amendment rights. You have guns, you hunt, you're a responsible gun owner. Speak to me, and I've got one other person, so I guess I'm going to be in trouble, about the fact on the assault weapons ban, there are more weapons in that potential bill that are allowed, automatic weapons, than those who are not. So can you speak to the fairness of an assault weapons ban and a potential 7-day waiting period?
An assault weapon ban to me is a no-brainer. Those weapons are made for one thing, and that's to kill people, and it's to kill a lot of people at one time. It's you know, seeing the damage caused by them, and I just can't see any other purpose for them.
Would a 7-day waiting period help as well on automatic weapons?
It's a start. It's a start if that weapon is not banned. It prevents someone from getting something right away.
May I, to Ms. Pringle, indicate in the state of Texas, we've been waiving, not we, the solution has been armed teachers. Armed teachers. Can you give me a sense of arming the teachers, those precious teachers that were shot and died, and then ones that were shot and lived? Can you?
Gentlelady's time has expired, but Ms. Pringle can answer briefly.
I appreciate it. Thank you so very much.
Putting the responsibility on teachers to carry guns to protect our students is not only irrational, it is unfair, and we know what we need in this country, and you just described it. It is that comprehensive, common sense gun laws, all of them working in collaboration, not arming teachers and putting that responsibility on them and causing more harm and damage to the people who have dedicated their lives to educating America's students. That is not okay. We know what we need to do. We need to do it now.
I thank the Chairman and the Ranking Member. I yield back.
Thank you.
I thank the witnesses.
Before we close, I want to thank all of our panelists for incredible and meaningful testimony. It is tremendously important for Congress's work. I want to thank each and every one of you for your time, your knowledge, your commitment. Before we close, I want to offer the Ranking Member an opportunity to offer any closing remarks he may have. Ranking Member Comer, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and again, thank the witnesses for being here. This was a meaningful conversation, discussion. That's what this committee is supposed to do, and I appreciate the opportunity, Madam Chair, and again, thank you for your time. And when you look at this issue, like any issue in Congress, we need to focus on where we can have compromise, because obviously the two parties have very differing ideologies, not just on the Second Amendment, but just about every major issue in America. But there is consensus to protect our school children. We all want that. I have 3 kids in the public schools. My mom was a school teacher, public school teacher. We need to, I think, when you look at the areas where there's consensus to act now, do something now, they are to harden our schools, to invest in better infrastructure. We had a school shooting in Marshall County, Kentucky a few years ago, and there was overwhelming support, bipartisan support to harden those schools. You have to go through 2 doors now in just about every school in the state, elementary, middle, and high school, to be buzzed in through those doors to go in. We need to invest in more school resource officers, and we need to better train those school resource officers. I think we saw that in Uvalde. The officer there obviously wasn't trained very well in that situation. Another idea that I think is common sense, where there's compromise, is something my friend Ro Khanna mentioned with respect to social media companies. We need to have some type of alert with these social media companies. Anytime a user posts anything about school violence, somehow that needs to get to the hands of the authorities. Somehow we need to have some type of communication between the school resource officers, the law enforcement, whomever, and the social media companies. That's a responsibility of the social media companies, in my opinion, that they could do better on. We need to stop the defund the police movement, and that's been an effort by some of our friends on the left. That's been an utter failure. Crime is on the increase in all types of crime. We need to stop that. And lastly, we need to ensure that we have prosecutors who are tough on crime, because that's been a problem in the name of COVID and everything else, with so many criminals that have been let out early release. It's just not working. And we're seeing that in the data, especially in the inner city. So I think there are areas where we can come together and compromise, and I hope that we can work together in a bipartisan way to better protect our public school children. Madam Chair, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Today we heard firsthand accounts of the devastation that gun violence epidemic inflicts on American communities and families. To our witnesses who shared their personal stories of pain and loss, thank you for your bravery. We also heard from a local government leader, from a gun safety advocate, a community activist, from an educator, and from a law enforcement officer. They spoke. We heard from a local government leader, from a gun safety advocate, a community activist, from an educator, and from a law enforcement officer. They spoke with one voice, calling on Congress to end this epidemic of gun violence. Let me emphasize that our nation's police, the men and women sworn to protect our communities, are pleading with Congress to pass meaningful gun safety laws. And I am proud to say that today the House of Representatives heard their call and is approving common sense gun safety legislation supported by a strong majority of Americans. This is an important first step towards protecting our children, and I hope that the Senate will pass this legislation without delay. But the fight does not end here. The gun lobby still has a powerful hold over many of my Republican colleagues, and they are opposing simple steps to save lives, like banning assault weapons, simply because it might hurt the industry's bottom line. It is time to hold this industry accountable for the suffering and death it has caused, including the death of Lexi Rubio, her teachers and classmates. 2 weeks ago, I wrote to the nation's largest gun makers, including those who sold the assault rifles used in the massacres in Buffalo and Texas. We wanted to get to the bottom of how much these companies are profiting from selling weapons of war and how they are marketing these weapons to civilians. Over the last few days, the committee has received information from these companies that is troubling. It is clear they are reaping enormous profits from assault weapons that are used in mass shootings of innocent people. This hearing is not the end of our investigation. In the coming days, we will continue to gather information and issue findings. I also intend to hold a second hearing to hear directly from the gun industry so they can explain to the American people why they continue to sell the weapons of choice for mass murderers. The fight to protect our children from gun violence is far from over, but based on the bravery and determination our witnesses displayed today, I am confident it is a fight we can and will win. Again, I thank you all for your commitment, for your time, for your testimony today. I yield back. Whoops. Before I close, I want to thank again everyone, and I commend all my colleagues. And with that, without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials and to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. And with that, this meeting is adjourned. And we're going to the floor to vote for gun safety.